Hello, I'm Kendall van Beveren, and this is my project on the hidden minorities of Tuvalu. I chose the title Hidden Minorities of Tuvalu because one of their most popular or most mainstream crisis right now is definitely climate change. Tuvalu is heavily impacted by climate change, and that obviously takes first priority in all of their political agendas pretty much, and takes pretty much all the focus. And I chose the title Hidden Minorities because there are also some other issues going on in Tuvalu that is clouded by this climate change crisis and doesn't get as much attention. So first, this is all kind of based on traditional values and religion. There is a very firm traditional belief in community consensus and idea in Tuvalu, and almost 86% of Tuvaluans belong to the Church of Tuvalu, which is formerly Ellis Island's Protestant church. Its Christianity is very strong here, and that is due to the colonization and when missionaries came over and brought over Christianity in the first place. So it is very common and a very traditional belief that husbands must discipline their wife if she fails to submit. Basically, a quote is, "Moreover, even though it is clearly explained in the Bible that a man should love the wife as Christ loves the church, violence against wives persists because of patriarchal practices that women, as helpers, must always submit to men as heads of the family." And so this kind of instills a lot of fear into women because it is traditionally believed that it is their place to be below their husbands, and so coming forward may seem that they're defying these traditional beliefs and defying their husband, and can create a lot of shame for the victim herself because of how family and her community will treat her after, and many wives end up pulling out of any reports that they do against their husbands. It's very common to report and then pull out because it is believed that these issues and domestic violence are between the man and woman, the husband and wife, and police should not be involved in the matter. So for gender inequality, it is still a very adamant issue in Tuvalu. Women still lack land and child custody rights, and over 44% of women in Tuvalu experience partner violence or domestic violence, yet only 1 in 3 seek help. And so this is, again, like the previous explanation I had, but it is also the male-dominated. Police forces will typically put the blame onto the female victims when domestic violence is reported, and even ask questions such as, "What did you do to make him hit you?" Very different from the Western point of view, where that is very uncommon now, where even the police believe that should be dealt with between husband and wife and should not be involved. Along with this, in politics, there is still a very large inequality of women represented in politics, as there have only been 3 women elected to parliament between 1978 and 2022. Another issue is sexual assault. So in Tuvalu, rape and child sexual assault only applies to female victims. It cannot be charged against anyone who commits these acts against a male child or a male victim. And it is pretty much described, or specifically rape in this case, is described as any person who has unlawful sexual intercourse with a woman or a girl. And that is in their penal code, section 128. And so legislation also does not explicitly state that marital rape and sexual assault are real crimes. There's no statement that explicitly says that, and there's also no public or legal definition of consent. And as well as that, the legislation that does in turn talk about these topics are still use very inappropriate or vulgar by using phrases such as indecent assault for immoral purposes and defilement for these victims. And again, also on another topic, when talking about legislation, the penal code also refers to people with mental disabilities as an idiot or imbecile. So legislation and laws are still what seems to be farther behind than Western laws, where here we have obviously crimes for marital rape, sexual assault, and all of these apply to victims regardless of gender. They can make a claim. However, still a little further behind in Tuvalu. And for same-sex relations, it is criminalized for two men to be in a same-sex relationship, but not explicitly stated as so, but buggery is criminalized and can have up to 14 years in jail if convicted, as well as gross indecency, which can be described as public or private between two males, is an offense with a maximum penalty of 5 years. There is also no law against hate crimes explicitly and no regulation of conversion therapies. So essentially, there are no laws that explicitly prevent violence against an individual for their gender identity or their sexual orientation. It is obviously there's laws against violence, but nothing specifically for that crime. And for no regulation of conversion therapies are essentially therapy to try and alter someone's sexual orientation and change them typically from homosexual or any member of the LGBT community into a more traditional, sought-after heterosexual orientation or cisgender. Adoption is also not available for same-sex couples, and there are no protections against housing discrimination for someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. Some helpful organizations that like to spread awareness about these causes is the Pacific Community Human Rights and Social Development Division, Pacific Sexual and Gender Diversity Network, and they typically can hold some conferences, meetings, just to kind of get awareness on these Pacific Islands that are typically less open to different sexual orientations or gender identities. Some solutions that have been implemented in Tuvalu is that in 2011, Tuvalu signed a Human Rights Council joint statement to end acts of violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And then in 2015, the UN launched a Pacific campaign against homophobia and transphobia that was attended by Tuvalu government representatives. And then later in 2017, legislative passed the Labor and Employment Relations Act to prohibit discrimination in the workplace based on sexual orientation. And then most recently, Parliament in Tuvalu approved a constitutional amendment that included a Bill of Rights that guarantees freedom from discrimination based on sex. However, it has been spoken about by the Prime Minister that it is very difficult to enforce these laws due to the geography of Tuvalu and the unlikeliness of victims to report to police. Some other legislative responses include that Tuvalu was the first Pacific country to launch a human rights action plan. And so basically what this means is it's from an interview or press conference, I believe, with the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, where he essentially helped create the first national action plan for improving human rights. And the National Action Plan would focus on improving rights for women, children, disabled people, and other Tuvaluan minority groups. The National Action Plan would also provide a time frame for addressing these human rights issues. And this was in July 2016, and this was spoken about by the Prime Minister himself, where he also stated, while efforts to increase women's leadership are ongoing, cultural and institutional barriers remain strong. So this is where he also acknowledges that there are the traditional values and still have this mindset in Tuvalu that does prevent these initiatives from working as well as they would. And so there have been some improvements. Women now hold 37% of government senior leadership roles, and that's a 3% increase from 2018. And then in the judiciary, women make up 53% of magistrates, which is a 40% increase from 2020. Here are some of my references.